Somewhere off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, there's a single fault line that federal disaster planners have already identified as the source of the worst natural disaster this country has ever faced. Worse than any hurricane, any wildfire, any flood on record. It's not a question of if. Every credible model built by the U.S. Geological Survey, FEMA, and state emergency agencies treats this event as a certainty on a long enough timeline. The only real question left is when. This is the Cascadia Subduction Zone, and tonight we're breaking down exactly what happens the moment it lets go. Let's get right into it. Let's start with what this fault actually is, because understanding the mechanics here is the key to understanding why the danger is so severe. Roughly 70 to 100 miles off the coastline of Northern California, Oregon, Washington, and southern British Columbia, the Juan de Fuca oceanic plate is being forced beneath the much larger North American continental plate, in a slow-motion collision that's been happening continuously for millions of years. That collision zone, called the Cascadia Subduction Zone, stretches roughly 700 miles from Cape Mendocino in Northern California, all the way north to Vancouver Island. The shallow section of that fault, down to about 20 kilometers deep, is currently locked completely solid by friction. That means the two plates aren't sliding past each other smoothly the way most people picture tectonic movement. They're stuck, jammed against one another, while the deeper plate keeps trying to dive downward at a steady rate of about 40 millimeters per year. Every year that lock holds, more strain builds up in the rock, stored as elastic energy with absolutely nowhere to release, like a spring being wound tighter and tighter with no mechanism to let it unwind gradually. Here's why federal planners specifically call this the worst-case scenario for the entire country, rather than just a regional concern. When that locked section finally slips, all of that accumulated strain releases at once, across potentially the entire 700-mile length of the fault simultaneously. That produces a magnitude 9.0, potentially higher, megathrust earthquake, placing it in the exact same category as the 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan and the 2004 Sumatra earthquake, two of the deadliest natural disasters of the 21st century. Coastal residents can expect somewhere between 3 and 7 minutes of continuous, violent shaking. To put that in perspective, most earthquakes people have actually experienced in their lives last somewhere between 10 and 30 seconds. 7 minutes of that same intensity is functionally a different category of event entirely, long enough for structures that survive the first wave of shaking to fail later as the ground keeps moving beneath them. And the earthquake itself is genuinely only the first act. Within minutes of the shaking beginning, tsunami waves generated by the same rupture are expected to reach the coastline, waves that could reach up to 100 feet in height in the hardest hit areas. For coastal towns, that leaves an almost impossibly narrow window between the ground stopping its violent shaking and a wall of water arriving. That's exactly why coastal evacuation planning in this region focuses so heavily on reaching high ground within minutes, not hours. Compounding all of that, newer research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that the earthquake itself will cause long stretches of coastline to physically subside, dropping by as much as 6.5 feet almost instantly as the fault releases. That permanent drop in elevation means many communities that currently sit safely above flood risk could find themselves permanently below the new waterline once the disaster is over. That turns a catastrophic event into a permanently altered coastline rather than something that simply gets rebuilt exactly as it was. Let's talk about how we actually know a fault we've never watched rupture in the modern era is capable of something this catastrophic, because the evidence trail here is remarkable. The last confirmed rupture of the full Cascadia Subduction Zone happened on January 26, 1700, at approximately 9:30 in the evening. No written record of that earthquake exists in North America from the time, because there was no colonial settlement along that stretch of coast yet to record it. Instead, the exact date comes from Japan, nearly 5,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean. Japanese coastal communities recorded a destructive tsunami striking their shores that same night, with no local earthquake to explain where it came from. What researchers later termed an orphan tsunami, a wave that arrived with no apparent parent earthquake nearby. It took modern seismologists cross-referencing those centuries-old Japanese records with physical geological evidence along the Pacific Northwest coast, including entire drowned forests and buried marsh layers, consistent with sudden land subsidence, to finally connect the two events. The orphan tsunami in Japan had been generated roughly 10 hours earlier by a magnitude 9.0 rupture of the full Cascadia Fault. Native American oral histories passed down along the coast independently describe a night of violent shaking, followed by a great flood, matching that same timeline almost exactly. That's a remarkable case of geological science, and generations of oral tradition confirming the same catastrophic event from two completely independent sources. So how often does a fault like this actually produce an earthquake of this size? And where does that leave the region today? Geologists have identified evidence of 43 separate large earthquakes along this fault zone over the past 10,000 years, using sediment core samples pulled from the ocean floor that preserve a clear record of each historic rupture. On average, Cascadia produces a magnitude 9.0 or larger earthquake roughly every 400 to 600 years. But that average hides a wide range of real historical variation. Some intervals in the geologic record have been as short as 200 years, others as long as 1,000. It has now been 326 years since the last confirmed rupture in 1700. That places us solidly within the fault's typical recurrence window, though not in a way that lets any scientist name an actual date. Current federal hazard modeling puts the odds at roughly 15% for a magnitude 8.0 or larger earthquake striking this zone within the next 50 years. Oregon's State Emergency Management Office cites a 37% chance of a magnitude 7.1 or larger event across that same window. Numbers like that can feel abstract in isolation, but stretched across a 30-year mortgage or a child's entire childhood living in the region, they become a genuinely serious planning consideration, rather than a distant statistic. Now let's walk through exactly what officials project will happen in the hours and days immediately following a full rupture, because the planning behind this scenario is more detailed than most people realize. A 2022 joint state and federal planning exercise modeling this exact event projected approximately 14,000 fatalities and more than 100,000 injuries across the affected region. FEMA's own projections describe millions of people left simultaneously disconnected from roads, electricity, clean water, and emergency services. That's not sequentially the way disaster response usually unfolds, but essentially all at once across an entire 700-mile corridor. Bridges throughout the region are expected to suffer severe, potentially region-wide damage, cutting off ground transportation between communities that would otherwise be relying on each other for support. Coastal ports, many of which handle significant fuel and freight distribution for the entire Pacific Northwest, are projected to remain non-functional for weeks or longer, directly complicating the delivery of emergency supplies at precisely the moment the region needs them most. Recovery timelines in official planning documents aren't measured in weeks, they're measured in years. Here's the part of this story that should genuinely concern anyone living in the affected region. This disaster can strike without any meaningful advance warning. Unlike a hurricane, which meteorologists can track for days before landfall, or even a wildfire, which typically shows some pattern of buildup before exploding into a major incident, there is currently no reliable scientific method for predicting exactly when a subduction zone earthquake like this will occur. Earthquake early warning systems like Shake Alert, active across the entire West Coast, can provide a few seconds to perhaps a minute of warning once a rupture has already physically begun, by detecting the fastest traveling initial seismic waves before the more damaging shaking arrives. That's genuinely valuable, enough time to automatically slow trains, pause delicate medical procedures, and trigger safety shutoffs at critical infrastructure. But it is nowhere close to the kind of days ahead warning people have come to expect from other natural disasters. Because the locked, shallow portion of this fault isn't producing frequent small earthquakes the way more active fault systems elsewhere in California do, there's very little day-to-day seismic activity along Cascadia to serve as any kind of reliable precursor signal. The fault holds and holds and holds until one day it simply doesn't. New research is also revealing that this threat may not be as isolated as scientists once believed. Drilling research conducted off the Oregon coast has uncovered evidence suggesting that a major Cascadia rupture could potentially help trigger activity on California's San Andreas Fault further south. That's raised the possibility of what researchers are now describing as a connected, compounding West Coast earthquake threat, rather than two entirely separate hazards. Separately, scientists tracking swarms of tiny earthquakes too weak to feel beneath Northern California have been mapping a hidden and surprisingly complex earthquake zone in exactly the region where these two major fault systems come closest to interacting. None of this changes the core Cascadia threat, but it does suggest the full picture of West Coast seismic risk may be more interconnected and potentially more serious in combination than researchers previously understood even a few years ago. It's also worth being clear that Cascadia isn't the only fault-related risk facing major cities in this region, because treating it as the sole threat can actually leave people underprepared for a more locally frequent hazard. New research on the Seattle fault zone found that smaller fault strands running directly beneath the city rupture far more often than Cascadia does, with a recurrence interval of roughly 350 years. Evidence suggests the most recent rupture occurred in the early 19th century. That means residents of a city like Seattle are living above two genuinely separate earthquake risks on two completely independent timelines: the inevitable eventual Cascadia Megaquake offshore, and a more locally frequent fault system directly beneath their own neighborhoods that could rupture on its own schedule entirely. So what does responsible preparation for a disaster of this scale actually look like? First, seismic retrofitting matters enormously for anyone who owns or rents property throughout the affected region. Older buildings that haven't been reinforced for earthquake loads are dramatically more likely to suffer severe structural failure during several continuous minutes of violent shaking. Second, if you live anywhere within the coastal tsunami inundation zone, know your evacuation route to higher ground before you ever need it, and physically walk that route at least once. Consulting a map after the shaking starts may not leave enough time before the first wave arrives. Third, build a genuine long-term emergency kit rather than the standard 72-hour supply most preparedness guides recommend. Official planning for this scenario anticipates isolation lasting weeks, not days, given how comprehensively regional infrastructure is expected to fail. Fourth, establish a family communication plan that doesn't rely on functioning cell networks, since phone infrastructure is one of the systems most likely to fail across the entire region simultaneously. A single designated out-of-region contact that every family member can reach independently is a simple, well-tested strategy for exactly this scenario. Fifth, if you live in Seattle specifically, remember that you're planning for 2 separate fault systems on 2 separate timelines, not just the one that gets the most media attention. And finally, take shake alerts seriously, even though it only offers seconds of warning. Those seconds are enough to drop, cover, and hold on before the most violent shaking arrives. That single reflexive action meaningfully reduces injury risk during an earthquake of this scale and duration. Here's the honest takeaway from everything we've covered tonight. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is real, it's enormous, and according to the federal government's own disaster planning documents, it represents the single most consequential natural disaster risk anywhere in the United States. It is not imminent in any way current science can detect. No legitimate seismologist can tell you whether the rupture happens next month or in another century. But it is coming with a level of geological certainty that very few other natural disasters carry, and when it does arrive, it can do so with almost no meaningful advance warning. The combination, long-term inevitability paired with complete short-term unpredictability, is exactly why this fault deserves more public attention than it currently receives. It's also exactly why the region's own leading seismic research network has settled on a simple guiding message. Don't be scared, be prepared. If tonight's breakdown helped you understand a threat that doesn't get nearly enough attention, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss it the moment new research changes this picture. Stay safe out there and take care of each other.